In this lesson, we're going to look at the origin of life. So, how did life begin? So, as a review, remember living things must have orderly structure, reproduce on their own, change, adapt and adjust, and remember they need to be able to get and use energy. So first, when did life start? Well, we think it started somewhere around 3.8 billion years ago. And we know it has to have started at least 3.5 billion years ago because we actually have fossil evidence from that time period. So here are examples of those fossils. Very, very small prehistoric cells. So at this time, what was the Earth like? Well, first off, there wasn't any oxygen. Turns out that oxygen is not produced until photosynthesis came about, and that wasn't until much later. And in fact, oxygen was actually poisonous to some of the early life. Now, however, there were lots of chemicals. There was water, liquid water, and there was a lot of heat because the early Earth was very hot. And these chemicals and water provide the building blocks, and then the heat provides the energy that's needed to assemble life. So where did life start? Well, there's a lot of theories about this, and obviously no one will ever know for sure. But based on what we know about life and what we know about what the Earth was like, we can come up with ideas that make sense as to how life could have started. And so some of these theories are deep sea vents. There's a lot of chemicals, and there's a lot of heat, and there's water, and so there's all the necessary materials and energy needed. Volcanic ash clouds. This seems weird, but volcanoes actually put out a lot of those same materials. There's water. There's actually, because of the friction and the static electricity, there are lightning bolts that go through some of these ash clouds. So that's a plausible theory. Ocean pools. That's kind of the typical one that people hear about. And even space. Not necessarily that life started in space and came to Earth, although some people think that, but that some of the building blocks have actually formed in space and then were brought to Earth. And this is somewhat plausible because we have found some of the building blocks for life in meteorites. So what was this life like? They are what we call prokaryotes, and we're going to look at these a lot more in depth later on. But they're very simple and they're very small, and today we see them as bacteria. So all bacteria are prokaryotes, and all prokaryotes are bacteria. And they used chemicals for energy. So remember, at this time there weren't any plants or anything like that, so there was no such thing as photosynthesis. And so since life has to be able to get energy in some way, they use what's called chemosynthesis, which simply means it's use chemicals to make energy. And they're what we call anaerobic, meaning that they do these things without oxygen. So remember, there wasn't any oxygen present in the early atmosphere, so you can't use oxygen for any of your reactions, so they are anaerobic, an meaning without. And now, life has obviously changed a lot since those original cells. And so why has this happened? Well, the process of evolution. And again, we'll talk about this a lot more in depth later on. But the Earth has changed, and so as the Earth changes, species will change along with it. And we've had all these new processes, things like photosynthesis. Once photosynthesis started, now there's oxygen in the air. Now organisms can become aerobic instead of anaerobic, and it opens up a whole new avenue. And so all of these changes have allowed life to change over the time period. So now let's look at the steps to making life. And again, these are just some of the kind of basic ideas about how life can be formed. We're not sure whether these steps are in the exact right order, but we're just going to go with this. So we have these basic chemicals, things like amino acids. And these are things that are naturally occurring. And then these basic chemicals get together and they form biochemicals. Bio meaning life, so things like DNA, proteins, the things that build life. And then they get a membrane around them. And once you have a membrane, you have a protocell. Proto meaning early. So this is kind of like a prototype for a cell. And then eventually that cell gets complex enough that it can actually reproduce itself. So remember, life has to have orderly structure. That orderly structure was when we get the membrane. So now we actually have cells. Then we have to actually be able to reproduce. That's the main thing that life can be able to do. So once that happened, now we actually have a living thing.